Once a man with military dreams, an extreme high IQ, Julian Knight seemingly had a promising future in the Australian Defence Force, aspiring to risk his own life to protect his home country. With that said, how could such a man turn into a sick and twisted criminal? A criminal who would become a threat not only to other military organizations, but instead, a threat to innocent civilians of his own country. Let's talk about it. Welcome back to Twisted Minds. My name is James, and today we will be looking at the case of Julian Knight. Julian Knight was born in Melbourne, Australia on March 4th, 1968. He is the first of 3 children and was adopted when he was only 10 days old. His adopted family had strong ties with the military, as his adoptive father was a military educator. He would teach soldiers the English language as well as mathematics and eventually Chinese. As a child, Julian was barely in one place for too long because his parents often moved. During his formative years, he lived in Australia and also abroad in Malaysia, Hong Kong, and Singapore. People allegedly claim that he was an all-around pretty happy guy growing up. According to Julian Knight, he had an enjoyable relationship with both of his parents while he was growing up. However, while he was always closer to his mom, he always looked up to his father and also made sure he was always on good terms with his siblings, his younger brother and sister. At a very young age, Julian began to show great interest in things that involved military, which wasn't very surprising seeing as how he idolized his father. After developing an interest in the military, Julian wasted no time in getting himself acquainted with the modus operandi of the military, and he ultimately decided that he would join the armed forces. In 1980, when Julian was only 12 years old, things took a sad turn when his parents separated. Following parental separations, children are known to exhibit sadness and other negative emotions. However, that was not the case for Julian. In fact, the youngster took it upon himself to show people that he was not affected by the divorce. The young knight chose instead to act like he saw the divorce coming, or maybe that it was something that he wanted people to believe, because later in 1986, word would get to the press that he couldn't bear having to watch his parents get separated, and that he would sometimes cry while thinking about it. In later years, Julian would also reveal to a psychiatrist that his parents' separation made him really upset because he'd expected them to at least talk to him about it before they made their decision. In 1982, Julian's mother moved him and his siblings to a new home in Ramsden Street, a residential area of Melbourne's Clifton Hill. Still, Julian showed no signs that he wasn't happy with his parents' separation. Neither did he tell anyone about his passion for the military. Despite the fact that Julian had loved all things military for years, it wasn't until he started school that his passion for the military came to light. He was a cadet in school and was usually seen wearing jackets from the Army. He also had a passion for buying and reading military magazines, notably Soldier of Fortune. As time passed, Julian became more skillful in his use of firearms. He became a member of the Army Reserve the same year he received his high school certificate. Once there, the Army Reserve went on an assault troopers course for 2 weeks at Puckapunyal, and Julian was trained on how to use 11 different weapons, ranging from a 9mm Browning pistol to a .50 caliber machine gun. A reservist, Dan MacArthur, opened up about the experience, saying, "Most people in the Army Reserve fantasize about walking down the street with an SLR in your hand and feeling the power you might get. But no one ever does it. Everyone joked around. You know, I'm a trained killer." Julian did, but in a different way. He was more dedicated than anyone else I knew. In 1986, Julian left for La Trobe University to study French, politics, and German history. Seeing how his fire for the military was still burning at the time, many are of the opinion that Julian's parents pressured him into attending the university. To further support this claim, Knight spent 6 weeks saying that the place was filled with leftover hippies from the 60s. Throughout that year, Julian did nothing other than remain unemployed. He also drank often, heavily at that, and it got so bad that he lost his friends and even his girlfriend. Later in 1986, Julian took a bold step and applied for entry into the military. He got accepted into the Royal Military College on January 13, 1987. Due to his immature and exaggerated self-confidence, Julian was made to work twice as hard as every other first year in the military college. Despite his love for the military, Julian was barely efficient in his duties, and he also drank heavily. No sooner had he joined the military college than he was charged with numerous military offenses. As punishment, his movements were restricted within the barracks by the sergeant major. However, Julian got tired and left the barracks one Saturday night for a friend's birthday party at a private bin nightclub in Canberra. Unknown to him, the sergeant major was also present at the club, and so he ordered Julian to return to the barracks. Julian refused, and as a result got into an argument with the friends of the sergeant major. He was eventually thrown out of the club by the bouncer, but he later quickly went back in without anyone noticing except his friends. At about 3 a.m., he got up to leave. As he headed toward the door, he passed by the sergeant major. Pulling out a knife, he stabbed the sergeant major twice in the face on his right side near the ear. Immediately, Julian left the club and headed to the police station to turn himself in. The charges against him were assault, malicious wounding, and assault occasioning actual bodily harm. Julian was bailed but had to show up in court on June 12th. However, the case was continuously adjourned to November 10th. As expected, this event signaled the end of Julian's military career. He had to resign. After he was kicked out of the army, Julian tried getting his life back together. He was employed at a store as a storeman and also applied for a training course run for security guards by a company in Melbourne. However, all of these attempts proved abortive because Julian went back to his drinking habits and things sullied from there. In no time, Julian's life had turned upside down, and one Sunday, he went to a pub, the Royal, to drink. Since it was a Sunday, the pub closed at 8 p.m. Seemingly unbothered by the pub's closing hours, Julian had a couple more drinks and left at 8:20 p.m. He went home to retrieve his guns, which he stored under his mother's bed. They were licensed weapons and were legally his. To list them all, a Daisy BB air rifle, a Chinese air rifle, a Crosman Model 766 air rifle, a Ruger Model 1022 semi-automatic rifle, a 12-gauge 8-shot Mossberg pump-action shotgun, and an M14 semi-automatic military rifle. He initially took with him the M14 rifle, the Ruger, and the Mossberg shotgun. However, he later returned to his mother's room to collect the M14, a steel ammunition box, and a leather shotgun cartridge belt from his mother's wardrobe. Afterward, he went to the front room to put bullets into the firearms. Julian stuffed a black combat knife down the back of his jeans after loading the 3 firearms and cramming his pockets with ammunition, including a suicide 7.62mm bullet in the front right-hand pocket. The M14 was then slung over his back, and he took the Mossberg and Ruger in his right and left hands, respectively. After arming himself to the teeth, Julian rushed out the front door of the house and ran on to Ramsden Street. Shortly after, at around 9:29 p.m., he arrived on the eastern side of the large 4-lane arterial road known as Hoddle Street, after dashing west down Ramsden Street and crossing a nearby railway line. In a horrifying twist of events, he pulled out his gun and started firing at 9:30 p.m. from the nature strip on the road's east side. In the space of just 45 minutes, Julian would terrorize the street, destroying anyone in his sight. He fired a total of 114 rounds from 3 weapons, killing 7 people and leaving 19 seriously injured. Out of the 19 who were injured, 2 were police officers. Nobody knows truly what could have triggered Julian to do that, especially since he felt that too many things were going wrong in his life at the time. It's safe to say his military resignation and drinking problems were 2 big factors. After about 38 minutes, Julian ran out of bullets and decided to make a run for it. He was caught and arrested in Fitzroy North. Although not many people know this, Julian was fond of creating combat scenarios in his head, where he ended up dying as nothing short of a hero. According to a psychologist, Dr. Kenneth Byrne, some of his dreams were about himself dying in combat as the hero protecting his company, or in other cases, it would be him fighting against overwhelming odds. And This is something that provides a lot of gratification to him. Another psychiatrist, Dr. David Syme, said that there was a sort of intricate detail about this fantasy life which was very unusual. According to the doctor, Julian fought different battles in his head, and these battles were often based on actual historical situations and factual in detail. Simply put, Julian would imagine himself playing the role of soldiers from real-life combats. He did not see the human beings around him as people who had blood flowing through their veins, but rather as tools that he used in his imaginations. The same Dr. David Syme also pointed out that Julian's imaginations were so vivid that he'd be sitting in the schoolroom, for example, and he'd look out the window and he'd see people walking past, and he'd immediately imagine this into an ambush situation, and into military terms, it was very vivid to him. Julian's fantasies made him less empathetic towards some people and completely hated the others. In one of his fantasies, he played the role of a policeman in South Africa and began shooting down the blacks. Reports have it that Julian might have embraced such a perspective from America's cultural colonization involving other countries at the time. To further expatiate this, a criminologist in 1989 made a speech in hindsight and said, "It would seem that as Australia is becoming more Americanized in its culture, we are experiencing the dawn of a new era, the assassination of the policemen, wanton killings, mass murderers." After the 19-year-old was arrested, he attempted to defend himself by saying, "They trained me to kill, and I killed." Julian blasted the local police for their tardy response to his attack and revealed plans to write the definitive account of his rampage, which he framed as a heroic tale in which he was the protagonist. Apparently, this was one of those worlds Julian took delight in creating, and also one where he got the chance to play the hero. He fantasized that Hoddle Street was being invaded and under attack, so he decided to gun down everything in sight with an M14, an M16 semi-automatic rifle, a Ruger semi-automatic rifle, and 200 rounds of ammunition. Eventually, he ran out of ammunition and was apprehended by the authorities. It was only after his loss of the rounds, however, that he eventually surrendered. "I performed exactly as my army superiors would have expected me to perform in a combat situation. In other circumstances, I would have gotten a medal for what I did." It's tragic to know that this invasion and attack were really just innocent civilians doing ordinary things, to be unknowingly massacred by a man who vowed to protect their country. Before Julian was arrested, he had a job at McDonald's where he worked part-time. While he worked at the job, he witnessed James Huberty's massacre on July 18, 1984. So, when Julian received a visit from a criminologist, Andre Kapataris, while in prison, he was asked about what he thought about the massacre at the time, seeing as he himself turned out to be a mass murderer. And to Andre's surprise, Julian talked about James Huberty as if they were friends. Andre also mentioned that Julian was very anxious to convince him that he was the best shot of them all. Julian had said, "Considering it was dark, I was shooting from a distance at fast-moving targets, and I'd had about 13 to 15 pots of beer. I did a really good job. Good old Chuck," referencing Charles Whitman, "did a good job too, didn't he? He was an ex-military like me, but I think he had sights." It was easier for Huberty at the McDonald's and Vickovic in Queen Street because the people they were shooting at were trapped. Andre had said after that conversation with Julian that his complete lack of remorse, no mention of any compassion for his victims during our interviews, was very disturbing to me. His logic even more. Julian was later condemned to 7 consecutive life sentences with a non-parole period of 27 years for one of Australia's deadliest massacres. He was classified as a young adult criminal under Victorian law because he was between the ages of 18 and 21, and because the city did not have life without parole at the time. He was sentenced to a minimum 27 years. While some people are satisfied with the punishment that was meted out to Julian, others believe that he should have received the death penalty. However, the members of this school of thought have learned to find solace in the Corrections Amendment Act 2014. The act implies that Julian will not be set free unless satisfied, amongst other things, that Mr. Knight is in imminent danger of dying or is seriously incapacitated, and that, as a result, he no longer has the physical ability to do harm to any person. Thanks for tuning in to Twisted Minds. That was the case of Julian Knight, and why don't you go ahead and click on one of the 2 videos on your screen for another one of our videos.